Okay. Uh, Today we have Dr. Reza Sharif Rezavian. Uh, Reza is an assistant professor of mechanical engineering at Northern Arizona University. His expertise is in robotics and control with a deep interest in neural control of human movements. Dr. Razavian's pioneering research conjoins state of the art robotics and control algorithms with the latest neuroscientific theories and musculoskeletal models to advance the field of human robot interaction. Dr. Razavian leads a broad spectrum of projects that span medical and industrial robotics, human motor neuroscience, and biomechanics. Dr. Razavian received his PhD in 2018 and master's in 2012 in systems design engineering from the University of Waterloo in Canada, and his bachelor's in 2010 in mechanical engineering from Sharif University of Technology. Prior to joining NAU, he held an NSERC postdoctoral fellowship at Northeastern University and a postdoc research associate position at Imperial College London. Dr. Razavian is the recipient of multiple awards, including an NSERC Postdoctoral Fellowship Award, the Springer Lagrange Award for Best Thesis in Multi-Body Dynamics, and the Society for the Neural Control of Movement Scholarship. Thank you very much, Dr. Razavian, for joining us today. I'm very excited to learn about your research.
Yeah, thank you, Amritaha. It's nice to be here. Thanks for the introduction. So a bit more informally, I'm Reza, Dr. Rezavian. Well, my dad doesn't have doctorate, but maybe Dr. Rezavian is my brother, big brother. So I'm Reza. I'm an assistant professor in Northern Arizona University. Um, Today I'll be talking a little bit about my past research and very tiny touch on the the most recent results I have towards personalized stroke rehabilitation using this new idea that I'm pushing called human aware robotics or human aware control of robots. So if I want to start the conversation, let me show you one video. This was Rashida, one of the students that graduated from my previous lab. And I'm going to show you this video, and I hope you are amazed by her abilities. This is remarkable, isn't it? So if I want to break it down for you, what I think is remarkable about her ability is we are all humans, and human body is made of a very large set of weird stuff, including muscles, tendons, neurons, and so on. We have a lot of degrees of freedom in our movements, and all of these movements, actuators, sensors, all of those are nonlinear. There is delays, there is noise. So this is a nightmare for control. And just the fact that we can move and do actions is remarkable on its own. And on top of that, we are constantly dealing with environment that has a lot of uncertainty, complex dynamics. For instance, the dynamics of liquid that we are interacting with. Sometimes the dynamics even evolve to be chaotic. There's all these very complex situations that we somehow masterfully can deal with. And if still you're not convinced that what Rashida did was remarkable, I challenge you to try to teach that to a robot. And in fact, people are trying and struggling with that. This is kind of the state of the art as of now. A robot trying to do a similar, at least with a mug, similar movement. And I want to draw your attention to the fluidity of movements between a human and a robot, and especially in the end when the robot wants to place the cup on the rack, it essentially drops it, and it is not something that was planned. In fact, it is very difficult to produce this smooth and kind of soft movement in robotics. So let's break it down, see what's happening. On the one hand, we have the robots. The robots have significantly better hardware. They are faster, accurate, more accurate, stronger, a lot more repeatable, less noise. The hardware is probably orders of magnitude better than a human hardware, the musculoskeletal system. But still, the controller, something called the wetware of the human body, is again significantly better than that of the robot. Our brain, our nervous system controls movements much better than the latest controllers for the robot. So in an effort to bring the best of both worlds into a task, that has led to the idea of collaborative robots, where a human and a robot kind of share a physical task, and the idea is to use the better part of each system to perform the task. So in such situations, when there is a human and a robot working in the same physical space on a task, the control becomes difficult. The kind of latest or the most advanced paradigm of control is something called shared autonomy paradigm. And in this case, the robot has more or less its own autonomy. It measures some information from the task or from the human user, makes its own decision, and performs the task with occasional intermittent interference by the human in terms of the authority. And there are a few good examples of this, especially in biomedical field. For instance, I have here a picture of an exoskeleton, and the state of the art in assistive robotics control is in this idea of shared autonomy. The robot waits, and it is measuring some signals from the human, for instance, muscle activity or movement. And as soon as it detects that the human wants to perform an action, in this case, in these examples, the patient wants to take a step, the robot infers that and makes this step for the user autonomously. So the action of taking this step is controlled entirely by the robot. This is great, but there are some important limitations. And one of the bigger ones is that this autonomous action of the robot is more or less, I would say, is rigid, in the sense that it does the same kind of step for a wide variety of patients or users. It is most likely not compatible with the specific strategies of movement or the constraints of their neural controller, and in many ways it is not adaptable to these interpersonal differences. So the whole idea of my research is to try to build robots, or control, more specifically, control robots that when they are interacting with a human user, it feels as if two humans are interacting. So I want to design controllers that kind of move and respond to action of a human the same way an actual human would do. And this, in my opinion, is one of the biggest missing links in collaborative robots. So as you may or may not have noticed, we humans have this kind of intuitive understanding of each other's movements. I can give you a few examples. So two people can lift up a table and move it, place it in another place in complete silence without communicating anything. Just the fact that we are physically connected to each other through this medium of a table, we exchange information and we understand each other's goals and the way we move. Or, I don't know, two lovers that can hold hands and walk without one of them impeding the other. It feels very natural, and we adapt to each other extremely fast through this intuitive understanding of each other's movements. And I'm not a dancer, but I have been told by those who are that, I don't know, in swing dance or salsa, this share of information, a very small amount of information, that's the way how people dance. So I want to bring this intuitive understanding to robotics. And this is especially important in the field of biomedical robotics, because an experienced therapist has built up this intuitive understanding of a patient's movement characteristics and possibly the requirements of the therapy. That information is critically lacking in robotics. So I want to create that kind of alternative to experience that the therapist has and use that to control the robot. So that is the goal of my overall research in my lab, that we want to build robots that have this internal understanding of the movement of the user. And robots are machines. Machines are controlled by computers. Computers work with numbers. So to do that, we need to build these mathematical models, essentially numbers and equations, of how a human movement, how the nervous system controls the human movement. So to achieve this goal, there are more or less two big giant pieces of puzzle that we need to work on. On the one hand is the idea of the basic science of it. We first need to understand how humans move, how the nervous system controls the movements. And I want to develop these mathematical models that have information at various levels of analysis, from high-level decision-making and strategy selection, all the way down to muscle activities and mechanical dynamics of the body. And on the other hand, we need to develop technologies, robot controllers that can take advantage of these mathematical models for human movement to make predictions and adjust their movement, possibly to identify the causes of neuromuscular disorders and try to tackle those. So very quickly touch on a few projects along these topics. And by the way, so I'm maybe 10 minutes into my talk. I haven't packed a lot of stuff. It's very high level. So feel free to stop me anytime in the middle of the presentation. If you have question or you think something is important or you want to talk about anything. So let's first focus on a few projects that I was involved in on the topic of sensory motor control, more or less the basic science of it. So sensory motor neuroscience has been active in probably a few decades. It goes maybe about a century, trying to understand how nervous system works. And most, I would say 95 or something like that % of the studies focus on relatively simple tasks. So the movement neuroscience is usually restricted to experiments that when a person comes in, they are asked to move their hand from here to there. They measure something, or there are some perturbations, and that's the kind of baseline paradigm, experimental paradigm in motor neuroscience. The issue is that our movements are significantly more complex in a daily life than these just point-to-point reaching movements that have been studied. And it is become more apparent, this issue becomes more apparent when something breaks in the nervous system, a stroke or Parkinson's disease, or I don't know, CP or any other issue. When we want to restore movement, we don't even know how the movement should look like. So it is important to study these more complex movements, to learn more, and to be able to develop better therapeutic programs. So in these contexts, motor neuroscience doesn't have a lot of answers yet. For instance, we don't know exactly what are the movement strategies when we are dealing with these complex situations, or how do we learn and develop these internal models or internal representations of the environment, or what are we optimizing. All of these questions are more or less unknown. So in an effort to move toward these real world contexts, I'm going to talk about two experimental studies. One was inspired by the activity of just, I have it here, moving a cup of coffee without spilling it. And to make this experiment more tractable and repeatable, we replaced the liquid with a ball that was rolling inside a circular cup, and it was implemented in a virtual environment. The second experiment was again inspired by the feedback-driven activity of balancing a pole on the tip of your finger. This is a continuous feedback-driven movement, very different from the ballistic movement of point-to-point action. And again, it was simplified and implemented in a virtual environment. So this is how the experiments look like. In the cup and ball task, we had this robot that would produce the same forces, haptic forces onto the hand according to the movement of the ball. And the task was to move from one side to the other without, ooh, what is happening? I hope you saw it. It was jittery on my computer. Let's try it again. Oh, almost a little better. So anyway, you have to move from one side to another without losing the ball, so the ball could fall out. And the other experiment, it is similar to pole balancing. It's an unstable task, and that is defined by this differential equation. And notice that to hold this blue cursor on the screen, the person has to move in the opposite direction of the cursor, try to balancing out this position of the hand with cursor such that the velocity of the cursor is not too large. And the difficulty of the task is determined by this constant value lambda. So we have these two complex tasks. Let's analyze the behavioral movement data first. In the cup and ball task, if I remove the ball from the cup, so give you an empty cup basically, it is a rigid object. And this is the case that has been studied many times in motor neuroscience. The movement pattern is very stereotypical. We have these smooth transition from the zero position to the target position, and the velocity profile is very smooth, more or less symmetric with a single peak in the middle. So this is everything we already knew. But when we have the ball inside, the movement patterns change drastically. Specifically, we no longer have this smooth pattern. We have sometimes a double peak, sometimes a plateau, depending on which subject we see the movement. But the important thing here is that the movement strategy completely changes. So it is the take-home message from these experiments is that across tasks, depending on what environment we are interacting with, we take completely different strategies. And the question is, what kind of generalizable control principle can lead to these two different movement patterns? In the end of the day, we have one brain. We don't have multiple brains for different tasks. And how a single controller can lead to two different patterns. And in the balancing task, this is an interesting one because it is an unstable task. So if you hold your hand still, the cursor will fall either to the left or right in the same way the pole would fall. So you have to move your hand left and right to try to keep the balance of this cursor. And because of that, and because there is sensory motor noise always, none of the trials are going to be identical. And within this task, we also observe two kind of class of movement. One where the cursor is kind of hovering around the center. That's the top row. And another class of movement is when the cursor moves to the side, but the person, in this case, it was a monkey, but we have the experiment with humans as well. The person doesn't want to bring it back, just tries to keep it wherever it is. So essentially minimizing just the velocity of the movement. So with these results, we even see that within a task, in the previous one, the difference was across tasks. Here we see even within a task, we have potentially different control strategies. But the same question, how does a single controller leads to these different movement strategies? So I mentioned the goal here is to model the movement. And without going into any of the details, you can, for the cup and ball task, you can assume a very simplified model of the body, including a muscle and a stiffness, basically the impedance of the body, and then use something called a stochastic linear finite time optimal feedback control with multiplicative noise. There is a huge literature behind it, but you can implement that. I don't get into any of the details. In the end, it is an optimal feedback controller that minimizes a combination of effort and movement accuracy. And you can see this is the solid blue line, that if we supply this controller just the dynamics of the two tasks, it can produce the same movement patterns that we see in our experiment. So this was a great success for us. For the other task, the balancing task, again, similar situation, a very simple muscle model that controls the position of the hand, and the same optimal feedback controller as the high-level control model can produce similar results. And here the interesting thing was we implemented essentially a knob in the model that we could turn it, either make it more velocity like controller to try to keep the cursor at a certain position, not certain position, keep the cursor at whatever position it is and just minimize the velocity, or crank it the other way and try to bring the cursor back toward the center whenever it was off target. And with that, you can compare it with the human data. And we could generate these two general categories of patterns. Obviously, the movements are always noisy, and every trial is different. Same is true for the model, which had internal noise. So when we look at the trials, average all these movements together, you can see that these models not only generate similar patterns of movement, but at a summary statistic kind of results. As the tasks become more difficult, the amount of success rate, the number of trials that you could hold this thing on top of your finger decreases as the task becomes more difficult, and so on. So again, this was a very good success in being able to model the strategy selection of the nervous system using a single unified framework. So it was a very quick tour of the results without any engineering details, but the take-home message here is that in our complex daily activities, we can perform any task with possibly a variety of strategies, and those movement patterns change. And the good news is, with a lot of limitations, obviously, in the models, we can to some extent develop models that can reproduce these complex movement strategies. So that's a very good result for a high-level decision-making controller. I've had another section in the middle about the biomechanics of the movement, the musculoskeletal, but for the sake of time, I have removed that. And let me skip to the better results, how we can use this to develop controllers for the robots that can make predictions about human movement. So the framework that we are using for controlling the robot is a nonlinear model predictive control. Within the robot's controller, we can present or embed a kind of simplified model of human movements. I'll get into a little bit of details of that in a bit. But the importance of this model is that we can supply it with just the goals of the task. For instance, I don't know, I want to go from here to there. And at any given instant, this model can be used to make predictions how a human will continue the movement. And using this model, the robot can think, okay, if I provide this amount of motor torque to that joint and this amount of motor torque to the other joint, how will a human react to these kind of perturbations and adjust its own motor torques to do something. And this optimization can run at at successive intervals, look a little bit always into the future, make predictions how a human behave, and adjust the robot motor torques such that a certain outcome is minimized or maximized. This could be, I don't know, minimizing effort if it's a, I don't know, industrial robot, or constrain or strain the patient to move in a certain way if it's a biomedical or assistive robot. So this general purpose framework is the basis of what we do in the lab and what we are working with. So a little bit about this model that goes inside the robot. Remember, it has to run continuously many times in the optimization loop. So it has to be very computationally efficient. Also, for the purpose of using it for rehabilitation, we want to have kind of good models for different levels. Human movement is a very complex interconnected network of components working together, from the high-level cognitive sides to the circuits in the spinal cord to the mechanics of the muscles and the sensors in the body and all of that. So we need to be able to capture some of that distributed control. And this model we have developed follows that hierarchical structure. And by the way, these results are hot off MATLAB. So I haven't even been able to very closely look at them yet. But I as of last week, I got these results. So I thought it would be nice to share it with you. So the highest level is the same optimal controller that I just talked about. Its goal is to make or define the strategies for movement in a very abstract and low dimensional space. So in a movement of an arm moving in 2D space, this abstract is just the two-dimensional space, a point mass, if you will, that moves in that direction. And it has some abstract muscle forces that it thinks needs to be produced in order to perform a task. This highly abstracted and low-dimensional muscle commands is then expanded into higher dimensions, into what is called muscle synergies, or sometimes called modules, or it goes with a lot of different names. And the site of these neuromuscular constraint is thought to be either somewhere in the spinal cord or the brainstem, or maybe even motor cortex. It's not fully known yet, and even the theory is not doesn't have foolproof support for it yet either. But nonetheless, it works. So we go from this two-dimensional muscle to I don't know, 4 to 6-dimensional synergy space, and then from there we have another dimension expansion going to the full musculoskeletal system. That in this example we have 6 muscles and 2 degrees of freedom arm connected to a robot. This is the simulation, and the good thing is this system is feedback, and it is, let me show you this. This is a fully predictive system. So it is very different from the methods that biomechanists use. They have a large nonlinear optimization that solve it for one specific movement, and that's it. This one, this feedback or closed loop control system can react to the environment, to perturbations, so on, all of that, in more or less similar way a human would do, and it adjusts its own strategy and muscle activities and all of that. It has details at various levels of analysis, from musculoskeletal and muscle activities all the way up to the strategy selection. And the good thing is it's kind of real-time implementable. This one and something second movement runs on my computer at roughly 100 something millisecond. So it is faster than real time. It is not quite as fast as it should be for real-time optimization yet, but it is on MATLAB, and I haven't optimized the code, so it can be improved. And this is, I think, my last or second to last slide, that now I have this model, I can embed it inside the robot's controller. Robots runs optimization at every time step, essentially. And for this toy example, my objective was to minimize the muscle activities in the human. So robot was adjusting its own motor torques to achieve this goal. When the robot was off, this is the same results I showed before. And you see some muscles remain active. I don't know, this one 20 newtons, and that one peaks at 60. When the robot controller turns on, we see we have this reduction in muscle activities to maybe half of this peak, and the other muscles become more or less inactive in the middle of motion. So it shows that the system is working. But something I noticed, again, I said these are new results. I haven't pondered on them enough. But these patterns of muscle forces and the movement in the task space is almost identical to an unconstrained movement. So that makes me wonder whether when a human, this is a testable hypothesis that we can try, whether a human can perform a movement consciously with zero muscle activities. Is that even possible? Or humans always want to do something with their muscles if they actively want to move? So that's something I'll think about it more. So anyways, long story short, now I have this multi-scale model that is kind of fast enough. We can embed it inside a robot's controller, and the robot can make prediction about the movements of the user or the patient and adjust its own activities or torques to achieve any outcome that we like. All right. So just to wrap up, now we have this basic paradigm. What can we do with it? More or less in the same order that mentioned here. The first step is to take these generic models that we have developed and make them subject or patient specific. Generic models don't capture the inter-individual differences. And specifically for rehab, when we have this huge heterogeneity in stroke or any other populations, it is very important to be able to tailor the model to the specific individual. So that's step one of the activities we want to pursue. And when we have that, one of the kind of novel aspects that I'm trying to pursue is to use these individualized or personalized model to try to pinpoint where the deficit exists, whether it is at I don't know, weakened muscles, which is unlikely. Is it at the neuromuscular constraints, the muscle synergies, or is it a problem with the strategy selection? When we just look at the outcome, the behavior, all of these are mixed. We cannot separate them. But when we have these models that can tell us, or we can probe into the model what is happening in each layer, we may be able to find better where the root cause of the deficit is. And the last one, more on the basic science of it, use these frameworks to theorize and make hypotheses how we can design novel exercise paradigms for certain pathologies. Yeah, I think that's all I have for now. So in the end, I want to acknowledge the people whose results I shared you with, the collaborators at the University of Pittsburgh and Northeastern University, and also my lab of N equals 1, my graduate student Aiden. And with that, I finish this talk, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Reza. That was very interesting, and I can't wait to see the products of your lab coming out soon and reading more about this research. So we have time for a few questions. I see here that some people, they have questions. Niken, are you here? If you are here, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I'm still here. No, I would say like my biggest question is like, because you're talking about like using this for like rehab or anything like that, but like, wouldn't each person or individual be so different that like the robot would almost have to be self-learning to a certain extent to like try to mitigate like these little things, so then it would almost be like at some like basically using machine learning to like try to combat something like that?
Yep. Yeah, that's a very good point. And yes, that is something I'm thinking about too. That is the requirement of this system to be able to work. But I don't know about what is the best way, either machine learning or these mechanistic models. For now, I'm focusing on mechanistic models for exactly the same reason you mentioned, that every patient is kind of different. And if you want to start from scratch and build a machine learning model, you need to collect a lot of data from that individual. And the amount of data is probably the restricting aspect. On the other hand, when we have these mechanistic models, we have a template, but we can, so the physics and the mechanics kind of constrain the amount of the parameter space, if you will. So instead of having hundreds of thousands of parameters, we are down to a few hundred parameters through these constraints of the mechanics. And that can lead to better model fitting with fewer data that can possibly be feasible within a single, first session of therapy. So that's what I'm thinking. I will certainly try to find people to collaborate with and try the alternative route using a black box machine learning model and see which one is better. But the core question that you raised is absolutely valid and right. And thank you for bringing that up, that these models need to be individualized.
Okay, thank you. So there are a couple of questions that I believe they are related. So I'm gonna start with one of them by Virginia. Are you here, Virginia Esmanek?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so let's just start with your question, and then we will follow up with others' questions which are related to your question.
Okay, so I noticed that you kept going back to using a mug or drinking from a mug and with your balance experiment, and I was wondering if there's a certain reason that you chose this as an example.
Good question. So how did we get to these? The cup task, the cup and ball one, is, so I mentioned almost most of the motor neuroscience are these point-to-point reaching movements, either just unconstrained, they ask a person to do that, or there are these perturbation forces that push the hand, and the people try to overcome that. The cup and ball task is very different in the sense that it is still a point-to-point motion, and there is still these perturbation forces essentially coming from the ball as it just moves around, but the perturbations are kind of self-induced. So you have control over the pattern of these perturbations, and you can strategize your movement to shape these perturbation forces. Either you can try to take advantage of that, and a good example of it is kind of a spin-off project is when you have these bells that you can ring. So it's a similar situation. You can take advantage of the forces that are created and entrain your own action into those dynamics to make a stable ringing. So these class of movements that you can either preempt your movement to kind of combat with the perturbations or take advantage of it, is the reason we started with this task. The other one is a longer story, the balancing. So balancing, you saw there is a monkey in the figures. So it is a task that was developed for a monkey lab a while back. I think maybe it is 6-7 years now. And monkeys, the task needs to be very simple, cognitively simple for a monkey to be able to do that. You cannot instruct it, oh, ring a ball at this frequency and entrain your dynamics and blah, blah, blah. So the task was designed for a monkey. And again, in monkey research, the usual tasks have always been simple. This task was a step up from the simple task. This one is important because it's a continuous task. It has continuous sensory information coming, and the monkey has to adjust the movement according to this incoming information, sensory information. So it is very different from the ballistic motion from one side to another, which is mostly can be done in the even absence of any sensory feedback. So that is where that task started. And when our group at Northeastern started collaborating with them, we tried to make a parallel of that with humans and move these two directions together to make connections between monkey motor neuroscience and human motor neuroscience, which is kind of a rare collaboration. It usually hasn't been done. So that is kind of the backstory behind these systems.
Great, thank you. So there are a few more questions. I'm gonna. Okay. Stephen Sant-Amand, are you here? Okay, so okay, let's we have a few questions about the COP example that you explained.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, there are two questions, and I believe they like to know about the feedback that if a robot can receive a feedback uh, for the weight of the cup. Let's say you have a cup of coffee, you're pouring coffee into the cup, the weight of the cup is changing continuously. So keep up with that weight and hold the cup steadily. Can we include any feedback loop in order to give that feedback to the robot and generate a movement similar to human action when holding a cup steadily?
I'm not sure if I followed the question properly. Let me try to answer and see
Yeah,
what happens.
let's say you have a cup, right? And you want some more coffee or tea, and you ask your friend to have to pour some more tea into your cup. So the weight of the cup is increasing, right? Continuously.
Yep.
As a human, we can hold that cup steadily because of the feedback that we receive from brain, and we can continuously receive the feedback from the muscles, the neurons, that the weight is increasing. So as a result, when the cup becomes heavier, our hand doesn't go down, we keep it steadily. Can we generate a similar movement or a similar thing with robots, and how does it work if we want to do something like that? Could I explain it better?
So you want to essentially recreate the poor controller of the human.
Not the poor controller.
So let me give you an example. Robots, well, in this particular example, if I have my cup, somebody pours water, I can hold it still, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
And you can ask a robot to hold it still too. It's a servo control. Robots can do it, in fact, significantly better than humans.
Right.
For the reason that robots have a lot faster feedback loops. Usually robots run on hundreds of hertz or kilohertz cycle time, so a millisecond delay. If anybody has a person next to them, I challenge them to do this. If you have a heavy book or something, I don't know if you have seen it. This is the interesting difference between a human and a robot. So if I have this book, if I lift it, I can hold my hand in the same place. But I don't have another person here. If another person lifts it, I do this. So there is various interesting difference between actions that I generate myself or actions that come from the external environment. This is the idea that led to kind of the notion of internal models. So as I send my command to my right arm to lift the book, at the same time, the nervous system sends the command to the left arm, knowing that the weight on this arm is going to be reduced. So that's where I can lift it without my other arm moving too much. But if a person lifts the arm, now I have to sense it, that the arm is, that the weight is lifted, the about 100 something millisecond delay goes to the brain and then come back to the muscle until I go up, until I figure out, okay, I went too much, I should produce less force. That is the better difference that we can try to implement in a robot. And doing that requires that we mimic the larger latency in the nervous system, which is possible, we can do that. And also we need to implement this internal model inside the robot, that now robot has either understanding of its own action or contrast it with the external environmental effect. And the answer is yes, probably we can do that.
Okay, cool. There is one more question that I'm gonna read that question for you. It is related to the nonlinear model that you described, and in the picture you had the monkey, but actually it was performed by human subject. So the question is, you showed actually two different responses, two different graphs. One of them was
Let me go
you
back.
categorize them into two different categories, right? So yes, here. What is the difference between these two categories? In one of them, you said that the cursor goes, for example, to right and then go back to left. In one of them, it goes to right. So why does that happen?
So this is again a long backstory. The monkey task, it was done a while back, and we were observing these two categories of movements. And when trying to analyze the neural data, these monkeys had electrodes in their brains. That is Aaron Batista's lab. So they measure up to 100 electrodes onto the motor cortex of the monkeys. And at the time, it wasn't possible to make a lot of sense out of how those neural data behave. So we observed these two general patterns of movement. When the cursor was kind of hovering around the center, and the other time the cursor moved or drift sideways, but the monkey tried to control it somewhere else. So this led to this hypothesis that maybe the monkeys are trying two different control strategies, and that's why the neural data are inconclusive. We cannot make a lot of sense out of it. So here we recreated the same study with humans, and another condition was we explicitly instructed humans to either keep it at the center or just to minimize the velocity of it. So if it moves somewhere, doesn't matter where it is, just keep it still. And that was where we could create this model to separate the categories of movement into velocity control, keeping it at a certain, keep the velocity minimized, or position control to keep the cursor at the center. And the model could create the two patterns. It was a good indicator, and the data also shows that. The next step that hasn't been done is, now with this knowledge, going back to the neural data of the monkeys and trying to separate these behaviorals into two categories and see whether the neural data now shows better correlation with behavior.
Great. Thank you so much, Reza, for your time and your presentation. It was great to catch up with you. And it was very good to see you after such a long time. Thank you for your great presentation. And as I said, I can't wait to see more papers coming out of your lab and reading your papers.
Yeah, thank you. I had a lot of fun presenting, and thanks for good questions. And let's see how it goes.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Have a good day. Thank
Thanks.
you. And thank you everybody for joining us for attending the meeting today. I appreciate it.